All right, we are officially live with 0 viewers, so we're doing great so far. Let me go ahead and post the "we're live" tweet. Excellent. All right. And I didn't finish going through my pre-show checklist before going live. That was not good of me. Just making sure I've got everything going here. All right, I do. Perfect. Thanks again. Thanks to join. Thanks. Let's start it off on the right foot here. I've been working on articulation, and it's working really well, as you can tell. Thanks for joining us once again for another episode of the PHP Roundtable. This is a live podcast of developers discussing topics that PHP nerds care about. The ultimate goal of this podcast is to learn a little something from each other. We don't assume that anyone listening is an expert PHP programmer, so we'll try our best to fully explain the concepts that we're discussing so that even a complete newbie will have enough information to take their learning further with a good Google search. If you're listening live and want to be a part of the show, send a tweet to PHP Roundtable with a question, and we'll try to get your question answered if we can. Today's topic of discussion is focused on open source and Git-Flow. So we're going to look at what open source is and how you, the listener, can get involved in the open source community. We're also going to be discussing an important tool that is arguably at the core of open source, and that is a version control system, specifically a version control system called Git. We're going to discuss how we can use Git to contribute to an existing open source project and how you can run your own successful open source project. And finally, we'll discuss where open source seems to be headed in the future. And I had a little discussion with our panel before we went live to see about actually breaking this up into 2 episodes. So I feel like this is actually going to be part 1 of a 2-part episode. And in the second part, we will be looking more specifically about contributing to open source on GitHub and how to find a project and how to run a successful open source project. So we'll be looking forward to that probably in February, because I've got a lot of episodes scheduled for the next couple months already. Now let's meet our panel. Let's start off, no in particular order here. We'll start off with Ben Ramsey. So Ben, Mr. Ben, he founded the Atlanta PHP user group. He's the organizer at Nashville PHP, at the Nashville PHP user group. He's also the guy who added the array column function to PHP core, which is really awesome. I think he's awesome for that. And he's going to have to bail out a little early because of having to bail out right at 2 o'clock or something. So I'm going to set an alarm here and give him an opportunity to do a shameless plug before he heads out. But welcome, Ben.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here.
Thanks, man. Thanks for coming on. We're moving on to Mr. Bo Simonson, and he's the co-host of that podcast, which I'm a big fan of, listen to, and he's the creator of Sculpin, which is a static site generator written in PHP, and a lot of people use that. Super popular open source project. Welcome, Bo.
Welcome. I'm super happy to be here. I missed the WorstCon. You were at WorstCon, right?
Yes.
Yes.
The WorstCon fun.
Yeah. That would have been our chance to meet in person, so I'm glad we finally get to meet, at least virtually now.
Yes, it's nice to meet you virtually. Soon to be in person, I'm sure.
Yep.
All right, moving on to Chris Walsmith. Chris is the creator of Ascetic, which is an open source asset management tool for PHP. So he's an open source guy, super appropriate for this conversation. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, happy to be here.
Awesome, thanks for coming on, man. And finally, we have Emma Jane, who's in England right now. So we're doing this, we had to do some coordination with time zones, which is fun. And Emma is a recovering open source developer who now works as a technical project manager. She contributes back to the community through her writing and video lessons, and she is currently working on a new book for O'Reilly Media called Learning Git for Teams. Super involved in the open source and Git-Flow fun stuff. Welcome, Emma.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you coming on. All right, so guys, let's do this. Open source. Let's tackle some open source stuff. For a complete newbie who's kind of new to this open source concept, what does open source mean? Ben, do you want to take this one on?
Sure, I guess. So I guess that's kind of a hard thing to explain. I think that a lot of newbies approach it and they just think it means free. But open source has a lot more to do with that, with like a philosophy around development, I think. And so it's more as in free as in freedom. A lot of times, that's as the Free Software Foundation says, than as free in, as in beer. So, I mean, you've got a lot of different varying perspectives on it, but essentially it just means that there's a licensing scheme that I place on my library that says you're free to use this without warranty, usually, and I'm not going to be held liable for it, but you're free to take it and do with it as you like, and also, maybe even contribute back to it. So that, depending on the licensing scheme, there might be some requirements around what you can, like what you can do with your modifications to it, whether you have to provide those back to the community or not, and so forth. I don't know if that helps nutshell it, but that's what I think of.
Absolutely. And so when you offer this free, oh, go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
Because I had a lot of these conversations with, whenever my mom asks me what I do, I have to explain it again. And, the way I typically explain it to people is that we all of us here build things on the internet, and there are common problems that are going to need to be solved in order to accomplish that. And there's only a little layer at the very top, which is the special stuff that makes whatever you're building unique. So all of those common problems, there's this huge stack of problems that we all solve, and rather than everyone solving them again every time, we solve them once and we put that solution out there, and it's goes into this, I don't know what do they call it, maybe an open source economy. There's a lot of different currencies that go around other than money, and we're all the better for it.
So I guess when you try to explain open source to someone who's not familiar with it, a common response is, why would you do anything for free? Why would you make code for free? Why would you do it for free?
It's fun.
I think
the answer is that it's fun.
I think Chris just hit on something that's kind of important. There are more currencies than just monetary, and so a lot of the reasons, I mean, the reason most people contribute is usually for reasons that benefit themselves, whether that's a library that they need in a project they're working on, or they just want kind of the cred of being a contributor to something. Kind of it makes you feel good. It's fun. It gives you something that you can maybe put on a resume, or it gets you involved in a community that you might not otherwise have been involved in. I think there's a lot of reasons you might want to contribute that just kind of all come back to benefiting you in some way.
Absolutely. Does anybody have any experience with having their open source contributions kind of coming back and rewarding them in a way that wasn't like a direct monetary reward?
I think anytime anyone uses anything that I've written, I feel good about it, as long as they aren't super upset because it broke something for them. But yeah, I mean, anytime someone uses something that you've written, I think that's a huge reward in of itself.
Absolutely. Jackass Woodcock says, does Ben Ramsey win the PHP Developer Cred game for having so many elephants on his shelf? So Ben's got a giant rainbow of PHP elephants on his shelf. Lots of.
I also have this very big one. Hold on, I'll pull it down. You can't see it on the video.
We talked about PHP elephants on the first episode on how they're kind of. Oh wow, there's a giant PHP elephant that he's got there. So yeah, so those are definitely super fun little things that the community does to kind of, you can earn them through doing different things, or just buy them and support organizations like PHP Women, which I just did today. I just bought a purple elephant for PHP Women because it's a good organization and I get an elephant in the process. So all right, let's move on to. Let's talk a little bit about the history of open source, and then we'll move on to some Git-Flow stuff. Where did this concept of open source come from? Like, who was the first guy who was like, hey, or the first girl who was like, I'm gonna just give this software out for free? Does anybody know about that, or like where it kind of came from?
I know a little bit about it, but I'll let other people talk if they want to jump in.
I'm not a history guy, unfortunately.
I don't know who the first project was. I mean, obviously the term open source is actually still pretty new. I think late 90s, mid to late 90s is when that the Free Software Foundation kind of started up, and this term open source came about. I don't really know who was the first one to use the term, but certainly before this, we used to have software just kind of available for free, freeware or shareware, and people would put their libraries out. But I think that it started kind of coming around and culminating, or not culminating, but congealing into what it is today, when the Free Software Foundation wanted to take their GPL license and just kind of build together a new operating system. And they were working on the GNU operating system at the time. I don't actually know if that ever started getting worked on, but eventually Linux kind of came in, and that became the GNU operating system. They kind of, convinced them to make it part of that. So GNU would take the kernel, which was Linux, and then a whole bunch of tools around it, and create their kind of operating system around that. That was like really early days, though, like mid 90s, early 90s, I think. And then it's just kind of kept going from there, I think. I'm not quite sure when the MIT license and BSD came out, but I know that BSD is historically related to the Berkeley Software group. And what's that?
You're mentioning licenses, right? Different licenses.
Yeah, I'm mentioning them because I think that licenses tend to. I know open source. There's the open source concept, and then there's the open source kind of license, but it's hard to kind of separate the two. And so I'm thinking in terms of the history of where these licenses came from, and they came from, like, BSD came specifically from the BSD Unix distribution, and then GNU got attached to the GPL got attached to the Linux kind of Unix distribution, and so those all happened kind of in the early 90s. But as far as where the term came from, that's around the time that it was coined.
So, and the reason why licensing is important in open source is who owns it, what can you do with it, right? Like the code that's being used, are you allowed to resell it? Are you allowed to kind of republish it? Those are all really important questions that you really have to ask when you're dealing with software that you didn't write, because by default in the US at least, any piece of work that you create is automatically copyright 100% to you, without you having to do anything. So you have to kind of give up that right and officially and say, this license says you can use it. So there's a lot of licenses out there, and I've actually considered creating an episode in the future for PHP Roundtable specifically dedicated to licenses, because it can get a little hairy depending on what kind of work it is and what kind of license it is, and what people end up getting in trouble for. So I think that might be a topic for.
So I just looked it up on Wikipedia so that I wasn't just spouting random bullshit.
Good call.
It says that the label open source was adopted by a group of people in the free software movement at a strategy session held at Palo Alto, California, in reaction to Netscape's January 1998 announcement of a source code release for Navigator. And then following on in February 1998, Raymond, who is Raymond? I don't have a first name here. Made the first public
Eric, probably.
Eric, yeah, that's probably who it is. Yes. Made the first public call to the free software community to adopt the new term, and then the open source initiative was formed shortly thereafter by Eric Raymond and Bruce Perens. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. And then in April of the same year, Tim O'Reilly used the term at the Freeware Summit, which later became known as the Open Source Summit. So around 1998 is when the term open source started getting a lot of usage.
So fairly new concept, at least in this world, and it's really changed a lot. The whole GitHub and we'll talk more about GitHub and what that is, maybe even in the next episode, but or the part 2 of this episode. But it's really just, I feel like open source has become kind of like a cool kids thing to do now. Like everybody's like contributing to open source, and you can't really call yourself a developer until you've contributed to an open source project or something. It's like a badge of honor. So
I will tell you, just as a funny tidbit, that in around 2001 or 2002, I was developing software for a small agency, and we were building the website for a local city government. And our contact there kept asking me, now this is going to be open source, right? It's going to be open source. And I said, well, if you want us to make it open source, we can. And he ultimately, it turned out he didn't really want us releasing the code. He just wanted to make sure he could see the code when we gave it to them. So he could open it up and look at it.
Misunderstanding what open source
That's
is.
what he meant by open source.
I think that's something that I was going to bring up, that I know for a long time that's what I thought as well, that open source meant the source was available for me to do stuff with it. And unfortunately, it was much later that I decided to finally start paying attention to licenses. And I just figured if the source code was there, I could use it however I wanted. So I think that's probably something that most new developers probably won't really understand right away, that just because the source code is there doesn't mean you can do whatever you want to with it. It wasn't until I started really paying attention about a year, no, 2 or 3 years ago, to what licenses I wanted on my software. And then all of a sudden I'm like, wow, there's a lot of decisions to be made here, and these things are really important, and I have to pay attention to this. And I think that's something that a new developer might not necessarily understand going into it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, just because you can see the source code doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with it. I think that applies to a lot of just software in general and music and things like that. There are some things that have to be considered. So I really do. I think this comes back to licensing again, and this is definitely a topic that I think we could talk a lot about. So I'm gonna definitely put that on schedule for like a future episode, probably in February or March. So let's talk about some of your all's specifically your all's. I'm from Kentucky. Y'all's open source projects. Let's actually hear from Chris, because you actually have one ascetic for asset management. What is ascetic, and what does it do, and like why would an average developer use ascetic? In what way?
Yeah, I mean, for one reason or another, there are a lot of really nice tools that relate to dealing with assets, and assets are JavaScript style sheets, images. These very nice tools for minification or different precompilers out there that are written in other languages. And so ascetic was my attempt to bring those into a PHP project, into a PHP workflow. So ascetic is written in PHP, but it allows you, and it basically provides a PHP interface for a lot of third-party tools like Sass, like Compass, like Less, CoffeeScript, Uglify, all of these really nice tools, CSS embed, that are not all available in native PHP versions. So it creates a workflow that to simplify the process of using those tools.
So when you say it provides a PHP interface, does that mean it's like one of those things that would just sit on your computer and watch the files? Like you run it and it'll watch your files, and then when you change them or save them, it runs like minification or something on the files? Is that what you mean?
Yes, you can run it that way. It also creates ways to define what your assets are. So inside of your template, in your view layer, these assets are all a part of your view layer. So it was one of my goals was to limit or to confine the definition of your assets to the view layer as well, so that you're not bouncing around in different files and leaving your front-end workflow in order to tie in a JavaScript or a style sheet. So
cool.
There's kind of those two sides to it: how you define your assets, and then how you process those assets.
Cool. Sounds awesome. I'll have to check it out. I wasn't able to look at it before I pulled you on, because this one was we scheduled this one actually in a couple days. I went to packages.org, where Composer, which is the fancy package manager in PHP. Packagist is basically this repo or archive of all the projects that Composer uses to pull in. So I went there and I just searched for some of the top projects, and Chris, yours was on that top list, and I just kind of like pinging people who had popular projects. So you have a pretty popular project that a lot of people use. What are you the only person with direct write access, or is there a team of people that have write access to your direct to your open source project, to Ascetic?
There's 4 of us that have access to that repository. Not everyone is active. So right now it's basically me and Stoff, who's a guy in France, who maintain the project. But there are about, I think last I checked, around 100 contributors to that one. So Ascetic.
Nice. That's awesome. And do you get a lot of people submitting bug issues or submitting contributions to the project?
Yeah, absolutely. That's been one of the problems with this particular project. Like I was saying, it provides this way to work with a lot of different third-party tools. And one of the things that I would do differently if I could go back in time is to only select very few third-party tools to actually include in the main repository, because we really don't need, a dozen ways to minify inside of, I don't think there's actually a dozen, but you get the idea, inside of the Ascetic repository, because there's right now 2 of us who are maintaining any pull request that comes in for one of those, and we don't necessarily use all of those. So that has become a bit of a maintenance issue. If I could go back and do it again, I would have only, if you want to use if you want to minify your assets, this is the official Ascetic filter. It's called a filter in Ascetic that accomplishes that. And then, it's something of a framework, so people could swap that out with something with their own minifier if they want. That would have made maintenance easier.
We have a similar
issues.
I have a similar thing with a project I'm working on. I just recently took over the lead or the maintainer for the OAuth 2 client package in the PHP League, and people had started putting a whole bunch of providers into it for OAuth 2 providers. So they would make we started out with obviously providers for like Facebook and LinkedIn and Google and Instagram, and other people started just adding other third-party providers into the same repo, and before you know it, it's going to explode in the same way. So for the 1.0 release, what I'm having to do is draw a line and say we're going to remove all these providers, and here are some interfaces that you can write providers to, and then you can create another repo just for the provider, and we'll link to it from our README or something like that.
You bring up a really good point, just a little bit of a tangent, but I kind of want to explore it a little bit, and that is this idea of breaking changes. Like when, as a maintainer of a project, you have a bunch of developers who have written code based on your code. So if you make a change to your code, there's a big possibility that it might break anything that the developer wrote on your code. So there's this big idea of trying to code in a way that will support old implementations of your code and not break backwards compatibility, or BC. We'll also know BC as breaking change, so I think that's a little confusing. But what is from your all's perspective? How do you guys determine whether you need to actually break something? This needs to be a new version that will break compatibility, backwards compatibility, and when to keep something and code it in kind of a convoluted way to make sure that old implementations can still work.
That's not hard. That's a big question. No, backward compatibility has really been a point of emphasis in the Symfony community for a long time, and that's the community I come out of. And it's hard because there might be something that you really want to do with the code that would break backward compatibility, or or a cool thing you discovered that's going to make it better, but you'd have to break backward compatibility in order to accomplish it. We can talk about semantic versioning. That is a versioning system, system of selecting version numbers for your releases that ties into backward compatibility breaks. So if you absolutely have to break backward compatibility, then you would need to do that in a major release inside of the semantic versioning system. And we try to do that as few times as possible. It's not something that you want to do, every other week. You don't want to put a new major release out, but after a while, it is appropriate to get a major release out and to make some changes that will break backward compatibility with it. After having been with the project for a while, you understand that this is a necessary change. It's going to break it. You document it and provide an upgrade path, bump it up to the next major release version, and then.
So if you have a breaking change, then you recommend actually giving a guide, like an upgrade guide, to explain what changed and how the developer can upgrade.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. This all depends on the size of your project, right? If you have a tiny little thing that's experimental and you haven't released a stable version yet, then of course you can break backward compatibility. If you have a big project, something on the scale of Symfony, which has its tentacles out in so many other PHP projects now, you need to be really, really careful about your stable releases and backward compatibility. So there's a spectrum, and it's a moving target for everyone. You just do your best. I personally, if I push up a release or if I push up a change that breaks, and then a report comes in, it's just like hanging over me until I can get it fixed and make it right, because it's a privilege to me that other people use my code. It's an honor, and I don't want to let people down. So.
Yeah, certainly a feeling of responsibility to support the people that are using your code, for sure. I'm going to be switching gears just a little bit so we can start talking about Git-Flow and how that ties into open source. Real quick, I want to mention Nicholas Wildart, I think is that, or Widart, Nicholas Wildart on Twitter, mentioned that there's a No Capes show right after this, and I think that's Kayla Daniels' show. I've heard a lot about it, haven't seen it yet, but I didn't know she was doing it live, so that's kind of cool. I might have to check that out after we're done here. Let's move on to version control systems. So Emma, I think, is having some problems with her mic or bandwidth. So if you are still with us, you want to take this one on. What is a version control system?
Sure. A version control system is basically a way for software developers to collaborate with one another without, or rather, while minimizing the possibility that work will be overwritten. So it allows you to track different kinds of changes that people might want to implement and either accept them into the larger project or not. It also allows the single developer to go through the history of their development sort of progression, maybe is the way to say it, and to see how their code base has changed over time. So if you've introduced a mistake somewhere along the line, you can go backwards in your development timeline to see where that mistake was introduced and to see how it used to work or how the code used to be written while it was still working.
So it's basically a track of your code history and allows you to do fancy things with your code as it progresses and you rebase things, right, as you refactor.
Sure. So for folks who are maybe familiar with Microsoft Word or with LibreOffice, at its most basic level, version control is kind of like turning on track changes.
Cool. That's a cool way of explaining it. For someone who doesn't actually use a version control system, say they're just a lone developer, should they use a version control system, and why should they start using one if you think they should?
So I kind of chuckle when I say, well, I'm only one developer. I don't really need version control. And I think that absolutely you still can use version control. And one of the workshops that I teach is called Git for Teams of One or More. And as a solo developer, you may not want to always be a solo developer. Maybe you've got a little project that you're working on right now, but in future you might want collaborators. What it allows you to do is to maintain, the history of that project over time, and to put in some of the decision-making rationale at each of those commit points along your timeline, so that the code will tell a story, but also in those changes. So when you do your track changes, you also have the ability to add comments. And those comments, or commit messages in Git terminology, allow you to say why you made that change, as opposed to just looking at the code itself, which shows you how the code has changed.
I think it's important there. Emma mentioned that the code should tell a story, but also the commits. I try to take great pains to make my commits tell a story, that they're not just random. Like, you don't see 10 different commits that all just say the same thing. And I have seen many repositories where people will do that. It's the same exact commit message every single commit because they're debugging something. And especially you'll find this in like Subversion and CVS repositories, where in order to get the code into the repo, you have to make a commit. In order to push it up to the remote repo, it has to be a commit. And that's how people are testing things. But those just tend to make really messy histories. And so I guess this is also me saying that I like Git better because you can have a cleaner history. But yeah, it should tell a story.
Yeah, so you're mentioning a lot of different version control systems there. You said Subversion, CVS, which is concurrent version system, and then there's also one called what is it, Mercurial or Mercurial?
Mercurial, Bazaar, Perforce. If we go back further in history, we would have, what are some of the old ones?
What's the old ones? The Microsoft Team. I can't remember the name of it.
So a lot of different ways of approaching this problem of managing code and things. But one rock star version control system came out a couple years ago. It was written by the guy who wrote Linux, is Git. And that's what we'll be talking about a little bit more in detail when we talk about Git-Flow and what that means. And Ben mentioned quite a few terms out there like commit and repo and all those kinds of things. And for the complete version control newbie, that might not make much sense. So we'll, since this podcast is all about learning, we will kind of briefly talk about each one of those keywords, just enough so where you can feel comfortable enough Googling more information and learning more about that. So for someone who uses CVS or SVN or some other version control system, what does Git offer that those don't? What makes Git such a rock star? Or is it a rock star? Am I the only one who thinks Git is a rock star? I mean, I don't know.
It's been so long since I used Subversion.
I recently had to use Subversion for a side thing, and it was really painful. It was horrible.
What makes it painful? Why is it worse than Git?
I don't know. This thing's hard to wrap up like in a short statement, but I think what was causing the pain for me in that particular project, so I can't say this about Subversion in general, is just that the way they had set up Subversion so that every time you commit to Subversion, it goes into the remote repo. So the big difference between CVS and Subversion and Git is that Git is distributed, meaning that the repo can exist locally. So I can make a whole bunch of commits locally without ever pushing to a remote repo. There might not even be a remote repo, right? I might
share. Can you tell us what a repo means? Because it kind of sounds like a Grim Reaper when you say it.
A repository. I get so used to saying repository. A repository is just like the place where your code is housed. It's you put things into it, you take things out of it.
So it's like the hokey pokey.
Exactly. You shake it all around. That's what it's all about. And you can have a local repository with Git, But with Subversion, you don't have a local repository, and with CVS, you don't have a local repository. But also with Bazaar and Mercurial, those are also distributed. I haven't used them very much, but they also have the concept of local repositories. And the thing here is that you don't need something like GitHub with Git. I could push code to my coworker's computer as long as he opens it up and gives permissions so that I can push to it or pull from it. And so the reason this worked really well with the Linux community and why Linus created this is because all these different they had all these different kernel projects, like sub-projects, that were being worked on, and originally they were all in one big repository, and all the code was there, but they needed a way to separate it out so that these people could work and share their code with each other and share their commits with each other without having to push it up to the master or to the upstream. So upstream is another term that you hear in distributed version control, and that's the kind of the topmost layer, or it doesn't have to be the topmost, but upstream is the layer you got it from. So I clone it from. So let's say, for example, you have cloned a copy of Symfony 2, and I want to work on your copy, or I want to work on your repository, so I clone it from you, and I might submit changes to you, and that's called submitting them upstream. But then you might submit them further upstream back to the Symfony repo, master Symfony repository. So you can see how this could branch down through many different tiers of teams working together or developers working together. It's not centralized. A lot of times we use it in a very central way, and that's why we have, and that also helps lead to just kind of a cleaner way of thinking about it, but it doesn't have to be centralized. So I kind of got off there talking about repositories. What was I saying? I was trying to say something.
Yeah. We were talking about what makes Git better, and when I'm glad you clarified repository, because we actually do want to talk about this idea of a repository and how in Git you have your own repository on your own computer, but it's very often that there will also be a remote computer that has a remote repository on it that you would basically sync your repository with. And there's a couple of hosting services out there specifically for hosting these repositories, like bitbucket.com if you use Mercurial or Git, and then there's also Google Code for Git, Mercurial, and Subversion, and of course GitHub. That's the one. That's the big rock star one, and that is only for Git. And today we're going to be focusing about Git-Flow while using GitHub. So with Git-Flow, before we get too much into Git-Flow and what that is, we do have to define a couple terms. We've already defined a couple of them, like repo and things like that, but we just have to fly through some of these terms just to kind of the newbies got to hold on real tight for this because we're going to just fly through this, but hopefully with a Google search you'll be able to get more info. But let's define a fork. We talked about repo, so what is a fork?
The way that I described this just a week ago, I think, was a fork is a marketing term by GitHub for a clone of another repository. In the case of GitHub, it has one extra bit, which basically makes the upstream relationship to who you forked it from. I think in a broader sense, the software community has used fork to mean when software diverges. It's like there's the main line of development, maybe the main project, and then someone forks the project, and now they have a different copy of the code and they go in their own direction. In the sense of GitHub and how they use fork, it's a little different. Does anyone else, am I wrong on that? Is fork actually something in GitHub or Git besides what GitHub has put on it?
I would agree with your definition, and I would expand it only by saying if you think about the shape of a fork, the tines or the separate bendy bits are sort of diverging from the common ancestor. And so the word fork, the way that I've thought about it, is the fact that you do have that common sort of bit at the bottom, and then the tines of the fork are separations. They've deviated away from one another. So that's where for me, the origin of that word comes from. But I do agree in those two different definitions, Bo.
Cool. That's great to disambiguate what those two different terms for fork are. So branch. What's a branch? Chris, you want to do that one?
Sure. So branching, to kind of piggyback on what Bo was saying about the traditional definition of forking means to take the code, copy the code base, and take it in your own direction. Branching is a similar concept, but staying within the one repository. So if you want to branch to work on a certain feature, which is eventually going to come back into the main line of the repository. So the branching aspect of source control is very important because it allows you to it allows you some freedom. If you create a branch to try something that you have no idea if it's going to work, and in order to try this, I have to delete half of the files in my repository or whatever. It gives you a lot of freedom to explore and to do destructive things to your code, because that's all happening in one branch, and meanwhile you have the main line, the branch that you branched off of, or it used to be called the trunk in Subversion. That branch is right where you left it, so you can come back to that if you need to work on the stable version of your code.
So would it be correct to say that a fork is a split between two repos, like copies, and a branch is a split within a repo of the code? Yeah?
Yeah, if we ignore what GitHub has done to the term fork, then I think that's another way of saying it is the fork would be branching without the intention of ever coming back. Branching is most of the time you have the intention of coming back, of bringing your changes back. There are other uses of branches for maintaining different versions. If I have a version 1.0, a version 1.1, a version 1.2, each of those would have their own branches.
Right. And now, and a related term, checkout. So if I wanted to switch between the branches, I would do what's called a checkout, right? Git checkout?
Yes, so Git checkout allows you to switch between branches.
Checkout's one of those confusing terms because when you, in Subversion, when you wanted to check out code from the main repo, you would use the checkout command. And Git, when you use the checkout command, you're just switching to a different branch within the local repo.
I remember that from Subversion. That was really confusing when I was switching to Git. I felt like Git checkout was such a big deal. I was like, but it's really just switching between branches. Let's define these two. They're related: staging and commit. And somebody from Subversion might be familiar with commit, but not necessarily staging. So, Emma, do you want to take that one on?
I guess, so with the hokey pokey, you can be on the outside of the circle or you can be on the inside of the circle, and you can be halfway in the circle in terms of having one leg in or the other leg out, one arm in or the other arm out. And the concept of staging is kind of that you haven't fully committed your work, you're just getting ready to get in the hokey pokey circle. So you've got that one arm in, but you haven't made the full commitment to actually saving those changes. So what we do in a centralized version control system, which we talked a little bit about earlier on, is if you want to be able to publish those changes, you have to make a full commitment and then push up your changes right away. And in Git, we can sort of, and in all distributed version control systems, but in Git specifically we're talking about today, we have this idea of preparing our changes in a staging area. So we can put only some of the files into our staging area. We can put only some of the hunks that have changed within a specific file into our staging area. And then we can use that commit command to actually craft the message for all of the bits and pieces which are relevant to the files or the changes that we've staged. So they're sort of, again, using that hokey pokey analogy, it's the bit that you're putting halfway in before making your full commitment into the repository.
And I'll often, going back to that storytelling thing, I'll often do a whole bunch of work and then only stage certain hunks, like Emma said, that I want to commit. And then I'll do this in several iterations of staging certain hunks and making a commit out of that those staged bits, writing out what that does, and I'll kind of do it in a succession. So that sometimes, like not all the time, but a lot of times I'll do it this way, just so that like there is this story, this incremental story, and they're not all mashed together into one commit that it's trying to do all these different features.
So it provides a lot of flexibility, staging your stuff before you commit, and which is the flexibility that we don't get with like something like Subversion. So Git is better in that respect. More +1 for Git. I know Ben is. My alarm's going to go off for you in like 2 minutes, so I'm going to hand this one to you. Merges and conflicts; those are kind of related.
Okay. Yeah. So when you're dealing with different branches, or even with a remote repository that you need to pull changes in from, you're going to have to deal with merging and conflicts. So let's just say, for example, you've got your master branch and you want to pull in the changes that other people have made to the remote repository. You'll run a command like either there's different ways to do it. I guess to simplify things, I'll just use one command for this description. You might run git pull. And git pull is going to do a fetch, and then it's going to take those changes and merge them into your branch. And when it does so, there's different merge strategies that Git will use, but rather than trying to go into all those strategies, it'll either do what's called a fast forward merge, which means it can just write all that new history on top of what you have, or it'll I don't know what a non-fast forwarded merge, which means it's going to take changes that you have and try to interweave those changes it pulled down in the middle or on top if it can. And I'm probably not describing this very well. Needless to say, when it's doing that, you've got changes that aren't in the remote repository. They might have changes that you don't have, and now it's going to try to write them all together, and it might have a conflict. So if you were working in the same file that someone else was working in, some of the code within that file might be in conflict. That is, they might have touched lines close to where you were touching, and now Git can't figure out how to weave them together. So you'll have to open. It'll let you know this before it can finish the merge, and then you'll have to open up that file and look for there are these little conflict markers that are arrows pointing either left or right, and you'll have two sections. One will be what you were working on locally, and one will be what you've pulled in from the remote repository. And then you have to intelligently decide which one to keep, or in a lot of cases you might have to keep a little bit from both. Like if you're making a change to something and you need to kind of take those two hunks together and merge them together, marry them together in some way. Then you'll remove the conflict markers when you're happy with what you have, and then you'll continue on with the merge.
And you actually, as you were describing that, I realized that there were two terms that were on the list to define, but we should have actually probably defined first, and that's fetch and pull.
Right.
And in a perfectly timed question, Sketch, the guy Sketch on Twitter, just asked a question. In PHP Storm, when using Git, there is pull and fetch options. Is there a difference between those? Yes, there is. Does anybody want to take that one? Or Ben, do you want to go ahead and take that one?
It just goes back to what I was saying. If a pull does a fetch and then a merge, fetch just fetches the remote pieces that have changed and puts them in your local Git database, but it doesn't actually merge them into the working branch.
And I think that's a kind of a confusing thing for people like coming from Subversion. I started in Subversion, and I think I just even recently figured out how this actually works. Is that when you have a remote repository, say like on GitHub, you actually have a copy of that on your computer. It doesn't really kind of list in your branches or anything like that, but it's like a remote representation of that. And so when you do a fetch, it pulls it into that remote kind of invisible repository. And when you do a pull, it pulls it into that remote invisible repository and then merges it into yours. Is that basically how it does?
Mm-hmm. You can also use a merge command too. Like once you've fetched it, you might then say git merge origin / branch name, and it'll take those fetched commits and merge them into your current branch.
And so that gives you a little bit more flexibility. If you wanted to just see what changes have happened, you can do git fetch, and then easily compare the two branches or repositories or whatever, and what's called a diff, or to see what's changed, and before you actually merge it, it gives you a little bit more control. So thanks for the question, Sketch, on Twitter.
And while we're talking about it, we should probably, because it's also related, talk about rebase in all of this. And I'll let someone else talk about that.
Okay, well, actually, before we talk about that, it's kind of getting close to where you have to bail out. So I want to make sure to give you an opportunity to do a shameless plug, because everybody's going to get a shameless plug at the end. So do you have anything that you want to shamelessly plug before you have to head out?
Yeah, my shameless plug, I guess, would be for another open source project that I'm working on with Jacques Woodcock and Jordan Casper, and that is Vert PHP. And it's a way of creating virtualized PHP environments and your local host on your computer, so you don't have to create VMs. So it kind of sandboxes everything into one environment, sort of like the way virtual env works for Python. So it's still very kind of alpha. We're looking for contributors, and we're also looking to improve it and get it to a 1.0, stable state. So that's my shameless plug for the day.
Awesome. Sounds amazing. I mean, managing multiple PHP versions is a real pain. So that's awesome that there's something out there that helps, because I haven't used it yet, but I've heard a lot about it. It sounds awesome.
And I also want to say just thanks for having me on. I know I'm going to have to bow out here in a minute, but
yeah, thanks so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate it. We actually you were almost on in an episode a little while ago, and then we had to kind of bail out last minute or something. But yeah, it's great to finally have you on. So we were going to talk rebase. That's actually I still have trouble with that one. I use it all the time, but I still don't even know what's really going on. There's a bunch of magic stuff, and then I get myself stuck in really weird situation when I try to use rebase, and I end up with these weird commits. And can someone help me?
Rebase is my favorite thing right now, actually, but I don't want to steal the thunder away from other people who can probably explain it better than me.
It sounded like Immo was about to say something.
Yeah, rebase is one of those terms that some people, when they hear the word, their heart fills and grows 3 sizes, to use perhaps a Grinch analogy, and for other people, their heart does not grow 3 sizes for exactly the reasons you described. It can be really confusing and frustrating and complicated when you don't really understand how rebasing is working. And I think that there's two. Just like fork has 2 different terms, rebasing also has 2 different terms, and I think it's really important to separate those 2 ideas. So the first one is in the sense of what I can do with my local history. So Ben was talking a little bit about the ways that he likes to craft his commits. Rebasing allows you to go backwards in time, and this is where it kind of gives me the hives, because it's a little bit history revisionist, and I can say, even though these are the commits that I made in my personal repository, I actually want to change the way history happened, and I want to squash those commits, or I want to expand those commits into a different version of history, and I'll end up perhaps with the same code at the very end, but just different messages along the way. We use rebasing to do that. And the second way that we can think about rebasing is how we bring our branches up to date. And if you're keen on getting a clean history, then you want to use rebasing to bring your branches up to date. And what that will allow you to do is when you go back in time and you look at the history of your particular branch, you'll see if you've rebased only 1 line of commits. But if you've got a branch that you're working with and you merge that branch back in, then you'll have literally sort of bumps along your graph in history. So rebasing to bring your branching up to date, I mean, I know it's more technical than this, but from a newcomer's perspective, it's just about keeping that clean line in your history graph. So if your team is brand new to version control and you're just finding working with version control to be a real stumbling block, start with merging. That you like, yes, fine, the rebasing police are going to come after me on Twitter for this. I get it. I'm willing to take the heat. But it ultimately gives you the same code at the end. It's just how your history looks. And then as your team gets more comfortable using version control and you want to take advantage of some of the more advanced features like Git bisect, then you're going to want to start thinking about how you're storing those changes over time, and you're going to want to revisit whether or not your team uses rebase to bring your branches up to date.
Yeah, I will say the stumbling block and the biggest problem that people have with rebase is, yes, it's rewriting history, but as it's doing that, it's changing the hashes of the commits.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you do a push afterwards, if you're on a shared branch, you might end up doing a force push, which is very scary, especially when you don't know what you're doing. And if you do a force push and other people are sharing that same branch and using it, then it can cause all sorts of problems. Because when you do a force push, what you're doing is resetting the branch to point to that new hash that is your latest hash on what you're pushing up. And when you do that, if other people don't have that, and they might have other commits in there, then if they do a pull down, it might reset theirs as well and seemingly lose those commits. So you have to be really careful, and I guess my main rule of thumb is just never force push on master unless you absolutely have to.
And this is where a system like Git-Flow can really help your team make those separations so that you aren't rebasing in a place where you shouldn't be. And really having that conversation as a team and saying, okay, well, where are we going to make our personal changes? Like, what's considered a personal history versus a shared history? And the Git-Flow system basically gives you a way to keep those branches separate so that you never really have to worry about doing a force push on a branch, because it's either personal work, your particular feature that you've added, your particular bug that you're fixing, or it's a shared history like the master branch.
I contribute a lot to the Facebook PHP SDK, and we're coming out with a new version pretty soon. But this is where I have most of my open source experience. And when my troubles that I ran into with rebase was that I always try to, what they say is squash your commits, like you guys mentioned, and that is kind of hide the way that the sausage was made. So when I push the first original change to the repo, I'll get feedback from people, and they say, hey, you should do it this way or that way. And then I go in and I change it up and I push it again. And as I do that, like, there's going to be all these commits and all these things. And so when you actually, Ben's bowing out right now. See you, Ben. Thanks so much again, man.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so basically what I like to do is kind of squash all that history, and so that when they finally pull it into the repo, it's this nice commit, it's just got this one line, and it's exactly the perfect peer-reviewed version. I like doing that, and I know a lot of people have mixed opinions on hiding that process, but the problem that I think I ran into is the second way that you said that you use rebasing, and that is to get up to date with the like the upstream changes, and I think help me understand like how I did this wrong. So I was doing a bunch of changes, and I had like maybe 4 changes I wanted to add, right? So I made a branch and I added a bunch of changes, and a lot of them were breaking changes and stuff, and then I wanted to do this other feature, so I branched off of that branch and I did a thing, and then I branched off of that branch and I did another thing, and then like 2 of the branches got merged in, and I wanted to get this other branch up to date, so I did like a fetch upstream, and then a merge, and then I tried to rebase it, and it just did all kinds of weird stuff. And does anybody have a maybe Bo, you want to haven't heard from you for a second to give you the really hard one? Do you have I guess advice for doing a lot of changes at once and rebasing that?
Yeah, so I think it's really hard to know exactly what kind of advice to give without knowing exactly what steps you did. But if you merged and then you rebased, I can see how that might have caused some issues.
And why is that?
Well, I don't know. But you really should only have to do one or the other.
Gotcha.
If the purpose is getting a branch up to date with another remote, if you actually did both of them, I can see how I don't know how that would work. If you first did a merge and then you tried to rebase, I don't know what you would have been rebasing against. But again, I don't know if that's actually what you did. But if you merged and then you tried to do a rebase, I personally have never tried to do rebasing to remove merge commits or anything like that. So I don't know what kind of impact that would have had on your project. I would say
the advice. Go ahead, Bill. Sorry.
I was just going to say that I guess the advice I would give based on what you just said is do one or the other, but don't do both.
Gotcha.
And if you
I
can
would
do
say
both,
draw a diagram before you do anything. What are you trying to accomplish? And then once you have a diagram, draw some arrows, and wherever you've got an arrow, you've got some kind of Git term that you need to apply. And if you're not sure what you're about to do, show your diagram to a friend and say, are these the commands that I should be running at this particular point in time? And if it all goes really poorly, if you followed your diagram, you can probably get someone to help you out, untangle.
Mhm.
That's some really good advice.
There's something called the Git ref log, and if you, it gives you
Oh, it's magical.
a history
Git ref log.
of your where your head has been.
What is that? Is it a website?
No, it's a command. Git ref log.
Oh, Git ref log. That's that's how you type GIT-REF space.
All one
LOG.
word.
REF LOG is one word. So
REF.
that will tell you. It'll say, okay, there was a commit, a merge, moved head from this to that. So you can even if you do something destructive like a rebase, you can still get back to where you were. It's very hard to get rid of something from Git once it's been committed to your repository. It's very hard to actually get rid of it.
Rebasing doesn't actually delete anything. It just unhooks and sort of sets to one side those commits. And what reflog shows you is the hash ID of the commits that are no longer hooked up, which you can then check out and save them back into a branch. So as Chris was saying, there's nothing is really ever gone before garbage collection happens, and I'm not sure how often your garbage pickup happens, but it's sort of every now and then. And even if garbage collection has happened, Chris, I think you can still, even if it's not in reflog, I think you can still go digging for things. Is that right?
I've never had to go.
Yeah, I've never had to go deeper than that either.
So this is actually really great information I've never known. So for anybody who is really screwed up and they feel like they've done just reset their entire repo, like that horrible, all the horrible things. So get reflog, GIT space REFLOG, one word, on your repo. We'll show this. I'm looking at my commit. I'm looking at the Facebook SDK's get reflog, and I can see all these rebases that I've done, swatches.
Yeah, it's your reflog. It's for the local repository. It doesn't have anything to do with
The
any
remote one.
repositories.
Gotcha. So if you've really screwed yourself over, there's probably a way out, right?
It's like if you're into sports ball, it's kind of like watching the slow motion replay of what you've just been doing.
That's really cool. That's awesome. All right.
But the advice that I would give you is not to branch off branches of branches. That's, I think, the point where you kind of did a bad thing. Try to make a small change, get it merged back in, and then come back to that other thing you wanted to do. So if it sounds like that's something you should have done instead of branching off branches, either that or just kept all that work in one branch. It's hard to say without knowing exactly.
Yeah, I was just really impatient. I had a little bit of time, and I had to commit to this one project, and I was just wanting to get a bunch of PRs done at once. And then I think probably what I should have done, like you said, is create a branch for that feature, go back to master, make a new branch from master. I just didn't want to have to deal with all the conflicts because there was going to be a lot of conflicts if I did that. But I ended up just with just a horrible rebase story. So oh well.
And do you also know about re?
What's that?
If you are rebasing, you want to reuse your recorded resolutions, and it's a flag that you turn on once and then you never have to think about it ever again, but it saves all of the ways that you resolve conflicts. And I know that there's ways to share it, but It's not something that I've ever really tried to do, but it's essentially a personal saving. So if you know that you've got 3 different branches that you're going to have to bring up to date, and they're all going to have merge conflicts in the same way, or they're all going to have conflicts in the same way, re will allow you to only have to solve it once, and then Git will just be like, oh, I've totally seen this conflict before. I know how to deal with this one, and solve it for you.
So you said Git re?
Yeah.
Is that like one word? RE?
It is, yeah. And it's a flag you turn on.
Ah, okay. I'll have to Google this and research that a little bit more, because that sounds kind of ridiculously awesome. There's so many of these little things. Like there's man, we could have a whole. I mean, we've practically had a whole episode on Git alone, but I mean, just all these things like a global Git ignore, so that I don't have to add those files that my IDE adds to the project. I don't have to add that to my Git ignore. So you have this giant Git ignore with 15,000 different ignores for these IDEs that everybody's using to commit to the project. You can add like a global in your global settings. You can say ignore this always, which I've done for the .idea directory that PHP Storm adds to projects that I'm working on. So, I mean, there's just so many of these really cool little things that it'd be kind of cool to have like a Git cool things you didn't know talk. Like this could be like 15 episodes of awesome stuff.
I think I've already told you most of the awesome stuff that I know about, though.
On top of rebasing, one of the things that I've gotten used to lately is the fix-up and auto-squash.
I don't know this. Tell me more.
So you have your local, the changes that you've made locally since you last synced up with your upstream, and you can, if you realize you broke something back then and want to fix it, want to save face and actually fix it in that commit, then you can add that, stage that small change and do a git commit with a -- fix up, and then provide the hash ID of the one that you kind of want to go back to.
I know about amend. This sounds similar.
Oh, amend is for the most recent one, but this allows you to go farther back. It's just like amend, yeah. But then you have to do a git rebase interactive auto squash.
That's so cool.
That's how you know you're doing it right.
Well, we're already kind of getting close to time, and we haven't even really talked Git-Flow. So I do want to make sure that we at least touch on that before we close up. And we're talking, when we talk Git-Flow, Emma, I think you had some thoughts on this. Git-Flow is an actual for real thing. It's not just some random term, right? Like it's an actual model that people follow.
It's a for real blog post that was written in 2011, I believe, and it was a series of thoughts about how to structure the branches within your repository for a specific style of software development. And certainly it's a very different model to continuous development or deployment, or how you would structure things if you're aiming for that way of deploying software. But it's sort of I would say the industry standard in terms of a reference point for products which are deployed in release numbers. And I'm not sure how much depth to go into it, but it's, there's a big long blog post there and lots of diagrams. Project managers, if you turn your head to the either left or the right, you will find that they are kind of like a little bit of a Gantt chart. So if you're reading the commit history, just turn those diagrams, I guess it would be 90 degrees to one side or the other, and you may find it's a little bit easier to read. And I think we can put the link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
When I finally get show notes posted on the website, I've been working for a long time on getting actually even syndication. I'm really close to getting syndication. We're rocking, but yeah, I'll definitely be including a link for that. Now,
I always just remembered as the NVIE model. So NVIE.com. On that homepage, it's still listed on their homepage, so it can be pretty easy to get to if you just want to try that as well.
Cool. So would you say that Git-Flow is basically this branching model that says you should branch this way and you should merge this way and you should maintain it like this and you should do this? Is that basically it?
Yeah, more or less. It gives you rules and reasons to make changes. So it tells you when you should make certain branches, who should be able to commit to certain branches, who can pull or push in different directions. It kind of lays that all out for you.
So I was kind of looking in on Git-Flow, and it was recommending that we use the master branch as the official history release branch, and basically using that as your stable. This is the most up-to-date, latest stable version of our code. But I've noticed that in a lot of PHP open source projects, the master branch is actually the development branch, like where people are just throwing their whatever random stuff, and it's the latest and greatest version, but it's not stable, and so they would have another branch for that, like version 1.0 would be the latest stable branch. Is that going against Git-Flow, or is that just a misunderstanding of what Git-Flow is recommending?
Yeah, I don't think they're following Git-Flow at all. I don't actually know very many open source projects that follow it, actually. Um, I usually notice that a project is probably following something similar to it if you go to their GitHub page and in the default branch is develop instead of master. But even in those cases, I don't know if they're actually following it not correctly, but down to the letter. I found the Git-Flow model to be very restrictive and not very useful for the kind of projects that I normally work on. I have used it in some larger companies where they have like, 20 or 30 developers or more with really long release cycles where these sorts of things are really important. But for the most part, in the open source community anyway, I haven't seen a lot of people following it that closely. But it might just be that the projects that I've looked at don't really follow it.
Do you think that people just don't know about it, or it's just they see another project using a certain branching model and they just copy it, or why is that? Why don't people follow Git-Flow?
I think it's very complicated. It's way more complicated than most of the projects that we see. As you said, you see most people using master. I'm a big person pushing composer, and you'll see people using dev master as the version where they don't do anything at all with semantic versioning. They're just happy to put their code up, and whatever's live, whatever is head at that point in time is the version that you'll get. So I think a lot of people don't actually put a lot of time and thought into coming up with a versioning scheme. So without any sort of versioning scheme at all, something like Git-Flow doesn't make any sense. Because you have like releases and hot fixes, things like that. I mean, that most of that isn't important to most of the open source projects that I've seen out there. Maybe something large like WordPress could use something like that, or Drupal perhaps. But like Symfony 2, they have their own release cycle. They've come up with their own things that don't necessarily have anything at all to do with Git. So Git doesn't have to get in the way with their workflow. They use master, and then they use branches for the minor versions like 2.4, 2.5, 2.7, that sort of thing.
It's actually cool that you brought up that it doesn't make sense to use Git-Flow if you don't have semantic versioning or any kind of versioning going on. And I think I'm making a note right here, Git-Flow and versioning, to actually kind of split that off into another talk, because semantic versioning we could talk a lot about that as well. But I think this is actually going to end up being like a three-part thing. This is part 1 of 3. The next one could be open source GitHub, using GitHub, and then another one on Git-Flow and semantic versioning and maintaining a project. And we could talk about backwards compatibility and breaking changes a bit more. And Nicholas Widart on Twitter just pointed out that it looks like Pyro CMS uses Git-Flow, which is that open source project that Phil Sturgeon made. I think that is Phil's, right? That's Phil Sturgeon's code.
I think so. I don't know if he's actively involved in it.
Yeah, I think he sold it or something. So that's kind of cool. Maybe we can look at it a little bit later and kind of see their process. What is Chris? What is your process? What kind of Git flow or what flow do you use? What branching model do you use for aesthetic?
Oh, for aesthetic. Well, there are so many buckets and depending on what context you're in, you're going to want to use a different branching model. But I think the Git-Flow branching model is really appropriate for a piece of distributed software, like something someone is going to download and install on their computer. There's a high bar that you need to get over in order to be confident in a release. and putting a release out and and shipping it and having people download that. And if something breaks, you're kind of at the whim of them coming back to check for the next update. And not so much anymore with automatic updates, but that's more of a scenario where I would see Git-Flow being useful for that. And if you have longer release cycles like we've been talking about. I personally, in my professional work, try to lower the bar as much as possible, make it as easy as possible to get something deployed. I'm much more on the side of continuous deployment, which is a similar branching model, but not Git-Flow. In the open source world, I don't. The way I structure branches is that the master branch is the development for the next version. So right now in Ascetic, we've released version 1.2, so the master branch is development for version 1.3. There's a branch called 1.2.x, there's a branch called 1.1.x, and a 1.0.x. So those are all the maintenance branches. One thing I don't know is what I'll do for Ascetic 2.0, whether that'll be developed on master or if I'll have to have like a 2.0 dev or something. But the other thing on this subject of PHP open source and branching and versioning is that Composer really makes it all moot, because that's how people are pulling in their dependencies now. They don't go to the GitHub project and try to find the right branch. They use the versioning scheme that versioning constraints that Composer provides, and those can be, there's an abstraction layer there, so those can map to whatever branch or whatever tag inside of the Git repository. It's pretty much moot at that point. So it's more of internal project management, working with your contributors. The people who are using the project are going to come to it via Composer, which is lives outside of Git. We're on top of Git. It's not Git.
Right.
That communication piece is so important. I just want to pause and highlight that because Git, it's sort of like the honey badger, like honey badger don't care. Git don't care what your branching strategy is. It's not going to enforce anything. It's going to let you totally hoop yourself and totally screw things up. And so that communication piece and the documentation piece and talking to, if you're on an internal team, like how does your QA team want to have final say over how something gets pushed out to production? How does your development team want to work? How do your contributors want to work if it's an open source piece? That's a human component. That's not a version control component. And so the more that you can have that conversation and write down the results of that conversation, the more you're going to have people understanding what the commands are that they're running and the rationale behind it.
I think that part of the reason that the Git-Flow model was so popular was that it was laid out so well, and it sort of took those decisions away from you. You didn't have to figure them out on your own. I know I found it pretty early on when I started using Git, because I didn't have answers to those questions. How am I going to do these things? When should I create a branch? What should I do if I need to make a hotfix or something like that? So I think that following a model like Git-Flow is helpful, because more people, it's kind of like a coding standard. If you know what the coding standard is, and you go to somewhere else and they use the same coding standard, it's really easy. If you follow something like Git-Flow, you can train people on Git-Flow, and then that knowledge is useful in other locations and other companies, for example.
That's a great point. So Git-Flow is just a recommendation on how to do things, sort of like is like a standard. And as you mentioned, Bo, it depending on your situation, it can actually be quite limiting for what you're wanting to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you got to kind of maybe just use it as a model to do your own model and see what works for you. But I think it is kind of cool when you can go on a project and they can just say, yeah, we use Semver, yeah, we have Git-Flow, and if you're already familiar with those two standards, then you can just pop right in without having to learn a new system, and that's kind of nice.
Yeah.
But that also has pros and cons, right?
I just pasted in a link to what GitHub has published as their workflow. They call it GitHub Flow.
Oh, excellent. It's very pretty. GitHub is a great way of displaying ideas, and they have a very pretty website here set up to show understanding Git-Flow on GitHub.
It's not Git-Flow.
Yeah,
It's GitHub Flow. It's
you-
everything's got a GitHub branded version of it when
Are
it
you
comes to
familiar
Git
with
repositories.
GitHub Flow, Emma? Oh, did we lose
I'm
her?
sorry, the audio is getting choppy for me.
Yeah, are you familiar with the GitHub Flow that Chris linked?
I have looked at it. There are probably, oh gosh, if you go looking for different Git workflow models, probably about half a dozen of these out there. There's also the feature branch, and like I sort of talked about a bit earlier on, there's everything from the branching strategy that would go along with continuous deployment and sort of mostly checking only into master. And I know that's a gross oversimplification, and I'm welcome, like people are welcome to complain on Twitter about this, all the way over to sort of the most rigid and the most granular as Git-Flow on the other side. And GitHub Flow is sort of a simplified version in the sense of streamlined a little bit of Git-Flow. And if I remember correctly, Brent, who is one of the trainers for GitHub, was saying that GitHub itself does not use GitHub Flow anymore to do their deployments. So if this is the Scott's sort of based on Scott's original blog post, I think. I haven't looked at this particular page, so I'd have to review it to see if this is matching up with there's a GitHub Flow article as well, which I believe is Scott, is his last name pronounced Chacon or Chacon? That's the problem of being on the internet. You never hear these things said out loud. But there's a ton of well, not a ton. I've probably run across about a dozen main ways of thinking about branching strategies and workflow, and then sort of slight variations on a bunch of them. And it really just depends on how your team wants to work together. I don't think there's any hard and fast rules, like certainly not from Git's perspective. It's more a question of what's going to work for your team. And if you've got a software product that has FDA regulations associated with it, you're going to have a really different set of rules than someone who's deploying a website a few times a day if you're doing a continuous deployment methodology.
Right. So we're actually kind of getting running over time quite a bit. I knew it would take a little bit longer for this episode, but we've tried to kind of talk about these two concepts of open source and Git-Flow and how they kind of tie together. We've kind of tied them together, but I think with the future episodes, when we start talking about specifically contributing to open source on GitHub and talking about Git-Flow or some sort of flow using Git and Symver, which is semantic versioning, or we're talking about versioning your open source project, we'll be able to get into more detail that might help out some of you guys who are in the open source world and have open source projects. And speaking of that, if you do have an open source project, I really want to hear from you. I usually do like a post-show, like after-party thing, and I post the link to this Google Hangout on Twitter, and so you guys can join in and just join the conversation after it's officially over in iTunes, or on the syndicated podcast. But if you have an open source project and you have some ideas that's worked really well for you, either by your branching model or something like that, or if you have some ideas of organizing your code, like actually like your source code and things like that work well in Composer, definitely come join us for the after party after we close this thing out. And we're posting the link on Twitter, and you can just join the hangout. We'd love to hear from you, or if you just want to come and hang out, and we'll just talk random stuff. And for you guys who are on the panel, there's no pressure to stick around. And you guys have been awesome for coming on, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So just only stick around if you got time for it and you want to do it. So I want to do a new thing real quick, moving on to this segment. And I usually do this segment called Something Old, Something New, Something Borrowed, Something Deprecated, but we've skipped over it the past couple times because we've run out of time, and it's kind of been random, and I don't know, I just wasn't super happy with it. So I decided to replace it with a new segment called the Developer Shoutout. So this is a new segment that recognizes a developer that has contributed a lot to the PHP community or to the open source world, and gives them a big shout out and thank you for their contributions. The developer is nominated by the panel. I asked the panel before we went on to nominate somebody a couple days ago. And they did nominate somebody. So, for this episode, the very first ever PHP Roundtable developer shout-out goes to Elizabeth Smith, because she has contributed so much to this community. Elizabeth was actually on the PHP Roundtable back in episode 5 for the PHP internals discussion, and she's a huge advocate of not only contributing to open source, but more importantly, inspiring others to contribute to the open source community and getting involved in the PHP mentoring community and things. In fact, I heard from 2 other people on the show that watched the show that after they watched Elizabeth on the PHP Roundtable, that she had inspired them to actually contribute to PHP Source and getting involved in the community. So that's awesome. And Elizabeth even personally pushed me to contribute to PHP Source back at PHP Tech this past year. She guided me the whole way from knowing nothing about contributing to getting my first pull request merged into PHP Source. So a well-deserved developer shout-out to Elizabeth Smith. And it's not just a shout-out saying thank you. We're sending you a small token of our appreciation, Elizabeth, for your awesome work. I have here a $25 Amazon gift card. Woo! So actually kind of paying off a little bit, $25 at a time. So Elizabeth, I'll be contacting you about getting this gift card to you in your hands. And this gift card was sponsored by Sammy K Media. Hey, that's my company, which makes amazingly unbelievable Facebook apps. So you can check it out at sammykmedia.com. So if you're interested actually in sponsoring the developer shoutout, this is a segment that I want to continue to do and recognize developers in the community for their awesome work. So if you're a company and you have something cool to like developers might want, like a gift card or some kind of free service, hit me up. I'll get you I'll definitely shout out to the developer and then give you credit for it as the business who sponsored it. So hit me up on Twitter at PHP Roundtable, and that'd be awesome. So let's close this thing out by doing some shameless plugs. Ben already left. So Emma, do you have anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
Yeah, so if folks want to check me out at Git for Teams, the website, it is sort of a starting point for a bunch of the articles that I've been writing and also the book that will be hopefully coming out next year. Please bug me because I am behind on my writing deadlines. And I've also done some videos on using Git for Teams over at O'Reilly, and all of that stuff, again, is linked from the website gitforteams.com.
Excellent. And I'll try to add these links to the show notes when I finally get that in like 2 years from now. Bo, you got anything?
Yeah, I have 2 things actually. I have Sculpin, the static site generator, sculpin.io. Come check it out. Emma's actually helped with some of the documentation, so if the docs are slightly better than they used to be, you can thank her for that.
And if I got stuff wrong, you can totally blame me.
Yep. Goes both ways. And also that podcast, that podcast.io. I have a co-host, Dave Marshall, in the UK. We do maybe once every 2 weeks we do a new episode. So check that out if you want to hear me ramble on about all sorts of fun stuff.
I love your show. I'm a big listener, big fan.
Thank you.
That podcast. And you guys talk about a bunch of stuff, like not just strictly computer stuff. It's like kind of life stuff, which is cool.
Yeah, life stuff. Life as a Dad is a program. We're both dads, so we have a lot of dad issues, especially when you have working at home jobs. So we do talk a lot about family stuff, and we talk a little bit about like entrepreneurial things as well. We both would like to do some side projects and things like that. So we're always talking about all sorts of things.
Yeah, that's awesome. And finally, Chris, you got anything?
My shameless plug for today is that it's my birthday tomorrow.
Yay! Happy birthday!
Happy birthday!
How's that for shameless?
Nice.
And you got an awesome open source project that we already talked about.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so if you're listening live, I'll be posting that link in just a second. For the next episode, it's all about SSL and TLS / whatever those 2 terms are kind of confusing to some people. Talking about peer verification and fingerprints and security and stuff. I've been in cahoots with Daniel Lowry, who brought TLS peer verification that just works in PHP 5.6. I've been talking to him about coming on the show, and I'm working on like 3 other episodes tentatively scheduled for January. One which is a very, very special topic that seems to always get overlooked by most developers and is a crucial facet of web development. Now, I'm going to keep the topic a surprise for now, but I'm going to give you a hint. All right, here's the hint. I'm just waiting to hear back from a few people on the proposed show date. We're trying to see if January 26th works for everyone. So, if you kind of feel like you understand what I'm saying here, what I'm hinting at the topic, the first person who can figure out that topic and post it to Twitter is going to win. Well, is going to officially. I'm going to mail you also a Amazon gift card like we're sending to Elizabeth, but you can just get it for just figuring out what the topic is. So here's the hint one more time. I'm just waiting to hear back from a few people on the proposed show date. We're trying to see if January 26th works well for everyone. So see if you can figure it out. If you have something you'd like to share, like a random topic or something that PHP nerds care about, you need to be on this panel. So hit me up on Twitter if you're interested. My Twitter handle is SammyK, or just ping PHP Roundtable on Twitter. So thanks again, Ben, Emma, Bo, Chris, for joining us for this discussion. You guys have been awesome, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.
Thank you, Sammy.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. So now that the show is officially over for the iTunes version, you guys are feel free to leave. I'm actually posting the link to join us in the live after parties for anybody else who wants to kind of keep this discussion going on open source stuff and Git-Flow and stuff that's worked for them, and having people share their 2 cents. So hopefully we'll get somebody who wants to say a little something or other. I've never done an episode where we started at like the mid-afternoon on U.S. time. So it's kind of cool that we're open at the same time as the nighttime in England and other places.
Nice.
Denver's been here before.
The audio is getting really choppy for me again, so I think I'm going to cut out. I am super happy to answer questions, though, if any of them come up, or continue participating on Twitter.
Oh, excellent. Thanks so much, Emma. We might be hitting you up on Twitter then.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on the show. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it. So, Denver, what's up? You got an open source thing? Or you use Git? Uh-oh, can't hear you.
So there's also the no capes thing is starting now.
Oh, it's starting right now. Oh,
Yeah.
So this might be a short after party, depending on how many viewers want to go over to No Cape. So is that at No Capes? What's the website for
I
that?
think it's nocapes.io maybe.
What is it?
Nocapes.github.io. Nocapes.net. Get it right eventually.
I'll have to talk with Kayla and make sure that we don't schedule our shows over each other, so that way we don't have to run into any problems with scheduling conflicts. I'm trying to pull it up myself here.
I'm wondering if this is working now.
Yes.
Awesome.
Up.
To answer your question, I use Git, but mainly private repos on Bitbucket.
I'm sorry?
I mainly use private repos on Bitbucket
Oh,
because
gotcha.
none of my code is worthy of being in the public domain.
Well, you never know. Maybe somebody could find it useful, right?
Yeah, that's true.
What kind of projects do you work on usually?
Just simple things that may be useful to people starting out with PHP. So simple blogs, simple CMSs, stuff like that.
Cool.
A few years ago, I also attempted a simple e-commerce application that turned into the biggest headache I've ever had. Mainly with shipping products within the UK, because our largest distributor doesn't give a public API of their prices.
It's kind of hard when you want to open source something, especially when there's like some proprietary stuff that you have to work with. It's always fun.
Yeah.
So do you contribute at all to open source?
Not at the minute.
Yeah.
In the new year, I'm gonna sort of find a project and get stuck in.
Sweet. Or do you have anything on the radar that that you're thinking about?
Probably a Twitter SDK, because any of the Twitter SDKs I've worked with have been lacking in a couple of features, or the documentation hasn't been that great. So probably
Cool.
contribute to documentation.
Have you seen the Guzzle client for Twitter, the Twitter API?
I haven't.
Guzzle, have you used Guzzle at all? The
No.
it's a HTTP client written by Michael Dowling at AWS. It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen because it makes it so easy to integrate with any API basically. So I made a Twitter SDK basically within like 3 lines of code using his package because it does all the OAuth for you. It does all the client, like it'll detect whether you have curl or fallback to streams, or I think it actually uses streams by default, and then it'll use curl if you want it to. And it's a really great package that makes it super easy to work with APIs. I've actually been pushing the guys at Facebook to try and implement it as the default implementation for the Facebook SDK, but I don't think that's going to happen.
I'm just looking at Guzzle on GitHub, and it does look really nice. So
Yeah, it's awesome.
They'll put it in.
Yeah, I mean, even if you like added additional features, like maybe you could just write an open source package that was something on like built on Guzzle. It'd make it a really light package.
Yeah.
There's some people responding to the hint. I think it looks like. So Sketch says, is it the collaboration and meeting between remote and local devs? Nope, that's not it. Mark Railton says, is it the Laravel 5 release? No, it's not. So nobody's figured out the next, or this special episode, secret episode on the 29th yet. So hopefully somebody will figure it out eventually.
I should probably clarify to you that on Twitter I am Sketch NI.
Oh, that's you! That's cool. Well, welcome, Sketch. Also known as Denver.
I would have, on Google, I would have my name as Denver, as Sketch, but they don't allow you to have non-real names.
Gotcha.
So I didn't actually get lunch before our meeting.
Oh no! I must be hungry.
I am getting pretty hungry, so I might have to step out here pretty soon. But thank you for hopping in, Denver.
No problem.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Bo. I really appreciate it, man. Like I learned a lot from this one, so.
Cool. Nice.
This is fun.
Yeah. It was nice to see you again, Chris.
Good to see you, Bo.
Yeah, and you're back again, I see. So I wanted to say bye. All right.
I'm gonna sign off to you, though.
Yeah, I'm gonna go get some lunch. I'll see you all later.
All right, see you guys.
Okay.
Thanks so much for coming on, Chris.
Yeah, thanks
Thanks
for the
for
invite.
organizing this.
Yeah, man. For sure.
See you guys.
See ya.
Yeah.
Elizabeth found out that she was nominated for the first ever developer shout out, and then she said, "I just cause trouble and don't get enough done in a day." That's what she says. What she does. She's funny. She's really cool. I think I'll be seeing her at PHP Tech this next year, in 2015. So, but Elizabeth, if you're watching, I'm gonna contact you and get this gift card to you. Well, do you have anything? It's just you and me, buddy. Do you have anything you want to discuss? I'm probably going to pop off in a little bit, just because I also didn't eat yet. but do you have any cool thoughts on anything?
Not really. Although I do just want to give a shout out to the PHP Roundtable. I was working on something a few weeks ago and had the PHP Roundtable discussion on APIs playing in the background, and I sort of started developing this API on a private project.
Oh, cool!
Give really good insight into how APIs actually work.
Sweet,
Rather than
awesome.
JSON data available and call it from another application.
That's so cool. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad it was able to help out. I mean, that was like the whole point of starting the roundtable, was so that we could all learn from each other. And I've learned so much from these episodes. Like, I just know a little bit about the subject, and then I know how to ask a question, and then get, like, a little bit more information out. But it's just like, man, there's so much to learn. It's ridiculous. It's hard to keep up.
Sometimes it is.
Yeah, always new stuff coming out and everything. Before I forget, I've got to copy all these. There's like this internal chat here for in Google Hangout, and I always try to make sure and copy and paste everything, so that way it'll be easy to write the show notes when I finally get those posted to the web. All right, so looks like we're going to do 2 more episodes about open source and Git-Flow stuff. That'll be fun. Probably going to be in February. Cool. Well, I got nothing. I'm done. I got to peace out. Thanks for popping into the after party, man. Well, maybe the next one will be a little bit more lively. Sometimes these after parties get kind of out of hand, especially when there's alcohol involved. A lot of people are. Jeremy McCullough comes in and starts a drinking game out of something. So.
I remember the last one.
Yeah, and the PHP internals one was a really good after party too. So.
I haven't actually watched that podcast yet, but I'll get around to it sometime.
Yeah, it's good. I liked the PHP internal ones. Was a really fun one. I want to have another PHP internals talk eventually. So, all right, man. Well, thanks so much for watching and popping in.
No problem.
See you at the next one.
See you at the next one.
See you, buddy.
Bye.